The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched Wyoming territory, its rays turning the endless prairie into a shimmering mirage of heat and dust. Jacob Thornton wiped the sweat from his weathered brow with the back of his hand, squinting against the harsh light as he surveyed his land. The grass, once green and lush in spring, now stood brown and brittle, crackling underfoot like dried bones. In the distance, the barren hills rose up against the cloudless sky, their rocky faces carved by wind and time into monuments of desolation. His modest wooden house sat like a lonely sentinel on the vast expanse, its unpainted boards weathered to the color of old silver. The structure was simple: 4 walls, a pitched roof, and a stone chimney that leaked smoke when the wind blew from the north. Beside it stood the barn, equally austere, housing his dwindling herd of cattle. The well, dug deep into the unforgiving earth, yielded less water with each passing week as the drought tightened its grip on the land. Jacob lived alone, had done so for 3 years now since Martha died of the fever. The silence of the prairie had become his only companion, broken occasionally by the lowing of cattle or the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. At 35, he was still young enough to rebuild, old enough to know the weight of loss. His hands, calloused from years of working rope and leather, trembled slightly as he held the letter he'd written the night before. The words were simple, practical, the kind a man writes when he's not accustomed to flowery language or romantic notions. He needed a wife, plain and simple, not for love or companionship in the way the poets wrote about, but for survival. Someone to help with the endless chores, to share the burden of keeping the ranch alive through another brutal winter. Someone who wouldn't expect too much from a man who'd already given his heart to the grave. "Dear Sir," the letter began, addressed to the matrimonial agency in St. Louis he'd seen advertised in a month-old newspaper. "I am seeking a practical woman of good character to join me as wife on my ranch in Wyoming territory. She need not be young or comely, only hard-working and of quiet disposition. I can offer a solid roof, adequate provisions, and fair treatment. I am not given to drink or violence. Please forward this to any suitable candidate who might consider such an arrangement." He deliberately emphasized his desire for a plain bride, someone who wouldn't draw attention or create complications. Beautiful women brought trouble. He'd seen it enough times in the small town 15 miles east. They stirred men's passions, created jealousies, disturbed the delicate balance of frontier life. What he needed was a partner, not an ornament. Someone sturdy and sensible, who understood that life out here was about endurance, not romance. Standing on his porch, Jacob looked out at the empty road that wound its way through the sagebrush toward town. Once a week, he made the journey for supplies, enduring the suspicious glances and whispered conversations that followed him. They called him the Hermit now, though he'd once been welcomed at every social gathering. But grief had changed him, turned him inward like a flower closing against the cold. The townspeople had their own prejudices, their own rigid ideas about how life should be lived. A man without a woman was suspect, incomplete. Yet a man who sought a wife through advertisement was equally questionable. It was a dance of propriety that Jacob had long since tired of performing. Let them whisper. Let them judge. Out here, with only the wind and the wolves for company, their opinions mattered less than dust. As evening approached, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, Jacob sealed the letter with candle wax. Tomorrow, he would ride to town and post it, setting in motion a future he could barely imagine. In his mind, he pictured a sturdy woman of middle years, perhaps widowed like himself, with capable hands and a face marked by sun and hardship. Someone who wouldn't expect tender words or gentle touches, who would understand that some wounds never fully healed. The coyotes began their nightly chorus as darkness crept across the land. Jacob checked the locks on the barn, made sure the chickens were secure in their coop, and pumped fresh water for the morning. These rituals, performed alone for so long, might soon be shared. The thought brought neither joy nor dread, merely a sense of practical satisfaction. This was survival. Nothing more. Inside the house, He lit the oil lamp and sat at the rough-hewn table where he took his solitary meals. The empty chair across from him seemed to mock his decision, reminding him of all he'd lost and all he dared not hope to find again. He pushed away such thoughts. Hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. What he needed was help, plain and simple. A pair of hands to share the work, a presence to fill the echoing silence. As he prepared for bed, Jacob allowed himself one moment of weakness, one fleeting prayer to whatever power might be listening. Let her be plain, he thought. Let her be ordinary and unremarkable. Let her bring no beauty to tempt him, no grace to make him forget his vows to the dead. Let her be exactly what he'd asked for. Nothing more, nothing less. The prairie wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending dust through every crack and crevice. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild. Jacob pulled the rough blanket over his shoulders and closed his eyes, unaware that fate had already begun to laugh at the simple plans of practical men. 6 weeks had passed since Jacob posted his letter, 6 weeks of drought and dwindling hope. Then came the telegram, brief and businesslike. Bride arriving Tuesday noon stop, meet at station stop agency. Tuesday dawned clear and merciless, the sun already fierce by mid-morning. Jacob dressed in his best clothes, a clean white shirt, dark trousers, and the jacket he'd worn to Martha's funeral. His boots, polished to an unfamiliar shine, felt strange on his feet as he hitched the horses to the wagon. The 15-mile journey to town stretched before him like a lifetime. The settlement of Willow Creek barely deserved the name town, a collection of weather-beaten buildings clustered around a single dusty street. The general store, the saloon, the modest church with its crooked steeple, and the new railway station that connected this forgotten corner of Wyoming to the wider world. As Jacob's wagon rolled down Main Street, he could feel the eyes upon him, see the curtains twitch in windows, hear the sudden hush of conversations. "That's him," someone whispered. "Thornton, getting himself a mail-order bride?" "About time," another voice replied. "Man's been alone too long. Ain't natural." By the station platform, a small crowd had already gathered. News traveled fast in Willow Creek, and the arrival of a stranger, especially a woman, was entertainment enough to draw folks from their daily routines. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house stood with her daughter, both dressed in their Sunday best. The Garrison brothers leaned against the station wall, passing a flask between them despite the early hour. Even Reverend Collins had found reason to be present, Bible clutched in his pale hands. Jacob tied his horses and took his place on the platform, aware of every glance, every whispered comment. The minutes crawled by like hours. Then, in the distance, a plume of black smoke appeared, followed by the mournful whistle of the approaching train. The locomotive thundered into the station with a great hissing of steam and squealing of brakes. Passengers began to disembark, traveling salesmen with their cases, a family heading further west, an elderly woman clutching a carpet bag. Jacob searched each face, looking for the plain, practical woman he'd imagined. Perhaps she'd changed her mind. Perhaps. Then she appeared. She stood framed in the doorway of the passenger car, one gloved hand resting on the rail, and time seemed to stop. The crowd fell silent, a collective intake of breath, the only sound above the engine's dying hiss. She was young, far younger than he'd expected, with hair the color of autumn wheat pinned beneath a simple traveling hat. Her dress, though modest in cut and fabric, couldn't disguise the graceful lines of her figure, but it was her face that struck like a physical blow, fine-boned and delicate, with eyes the color of sage honey and lips that needed no rouge to enhance their natural rose. Dear God, someone behind Jacob breathed. Would you look at that? She descended the steps with careful dignity, a single trunk her only luggage. When her feet touched the platform, she looked up, scanning the crowd with those remarkable eyes until they found Jacob. He knew he should move, should step forward and introduce himself, but his legs had turned to stone. The thought blazed through his mind like wildfire. He expected a plain bride, but the beauty who arrived made him fear his own desire. Somehow, he forced himself forward. "Miss..." He realized he didn't even know her full name. The agency had only provided initials, E.M. "Miss Foster," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Emma Foster. You must be Mr. Thornton." He managed a nod, acutely aware of the crowd pressing closer, of the whispers rising like buzzing flies. "She can't be serious." "Mrs." Henderson hissed to her daughter. "A woman like that, marrying Jacob Thornton. Must be running from something," one of the Garrison brothers suggested, loud enough for all to hear. "Or hiding something. No decent woman that looks like that needs to answer advertisements." Emma's chin lifted slightly, but she gave no other sign she'd heard. She kept her eyes on Jacob. Waiting. "My wagon's this way," he managed, reaching for her trunk. Their hands brushed as they both grasped the handle, and he jerked back as if burned. The walk to the wagon felt like miles, with half the town following at a discreet distance. Questions hung in the air, unspoken but heavy as storm clouds. Why would a woman of such beauty choose this path? What secrets drove her to answer an advertisement for a plain bride to a lonely rancher? The speculation began before they'd even left the platform. "Mark my words. Mrs." Henderson announced to anyone within earshot. "That woman brings trouble. Beauty like that always does." As Jacob helped Emma onto the wagon seat, he caught a glimpse of something in her eyes, a weariness that seemed at odds with her youth, a guarded quality that spoke of walls built high and strong. She sat straight-backed beside him, hands folded in her lap, saying nothing as he guided the horses out of town. Behind them, Willow Creek buzzed with gossip. The pretty new bride of the hermit rancher would be the talk for weeks to come. Men would find excuses to ride out past the Thornton place. Wives would watch their husbands with narrowed eyes. The delicate balance of their small community had been disturbed, just as Jacob had feared. The road stretched before them, dusty and long. Emma had pulled her hat low against the sun, casting her features in shadow. She hadn't spoken since leaving the station, hadn't complained about the dust or the heat or the obvious hostility of the townspeople. This silence, which should have pleased him, instead made him unaccountably nervous. "It's not what you expected," he said finally, gesturing at the barren landscape. "I expected nothing," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Expectations are luxuries I can no longer afford." The words hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Jacob glanced at her profile, saw the tight set of her jaw, the way her fingers gripped each other until the knuckles showed white through her gloves. Whatever had driven her to answer his advertisement, it wasn't the romantic notions of a silly girl. Something had carved away her innocence, left her as guarded as he was. They rode in silence after that, two strangers bound by necessity rather than affection, while the sun beat down and the prairie stretched endlessly before them. Neither spoke of the fears that gnawed at them, his terror of feeling again, hers of whatever shadow had driven her west. They simply endured, as people did in this hard land, putting 1 mile behind them and then another, while the town's whispers faded into the wind. But the damage was already done. Emma Foster's beauty had been seen, noted, judged, in a place where women were scarce and beauty scarcer still. She would be a catalyst for desires and resentments that had long lay dormant. Jacob had wanted a plain bride to avoid complications. Instead, he'd gotten Emma, and with her, all the trouble he'd tried so hard to avoid. The journey back to the ranch seemed endless, the wagon wheels catching in ruts and sending up clouds of red dust that settled on everything. Emma held a handkerchief to her face, but made no complaint as they jolted along the rough track. The vast sky pressed down upon them, a dome of relentless blue that offered no mercy from the afternoon sun. As they climbed a rise, Jacob gestured ahead. There it is. The ranch spread before them, the weathered house, the barn, the few outbuildings, all dwarfed by the immensity of the prairie. He watched her face from the corner of his eye, saw her take in the isolation, the austere simplicity of what would be her home. "It's very peaceful," she said quietly. "It's lonely," he corrected, wanting no false expectations between them. She turned to look at him then, those honey-colored eyes steady. Sometimes lonely is what a person needs. The words struck deeper than she could have intended. He clicked his tongue at the horses, urging them down the slope toward home. When they pulled up before the house, Emma climbed down before he could offer assistance. She stood for a moment, one hand shading her eyes as she surveyed her new domain. The chickens scratched in their pen, raising small dust clouds. The garden plot beside the house lay barren, victim to the drought and neglect. A loose board on the porch creaked in the wind. "I'll get your trunk," Jacob said, lifting it from the wagon bed. "I'll show you inside." The house felt smaller with her in it. She moved through the main room, taking in the simple furnishings, the table and 2 chairs, the wood stove, the shelves holding a few dishes and supplies. Everything was clean, but Spartan. A bachelor's dwelling with no soft touches. "Your room is through here," he said, leading her to the small chamber off the main room. It held a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. It was... He stopped, unwilling to say it had been Martha's sewing room. "It's small, but it's private. It's fine." She set her hat on the bed, already calculating. "Where do you keep the water?" "There's a well out back. I'll show you." They walked the property as the sun began its descent. He showed her the well, demonstrating the pump that required increasingly more effort to yield water. She watched intently, asking no questions but missing nothing. At the chicken coop, she studied the hens with a practical eye. "How many eggs do they lay?" "Not many lately. The heat's got them off their laying." She nodded, filing the information away. "At the garden plot." She knelt and sifted the dry soil through her fingers. "Nothing's grown there in 2 years," he said. "Soil's not dead, just thirsty." She stood, dusting her hands on her skirt. With enough work and water, something might grow again. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither acknowledged. As darkness approached, she set about making supper with the supplies at hand. Jacob sat at the table, ostensibly mending a bridle but watching her work. She moved with quiet efficiency, finding what she needed, making do with what was available. Soon the smell of biscuits and bean soup filled the room. They ate in silence, the lamp casting a circle of yellow light that emphasized the darkness beyond. The empty chair he'd imagined filled was occupied now, but the reality was more unsettling than the absence had been. She was too young, too beautiful, too much of everything he'd tried to avoid. "We should discuss the arrangements," he said finally, pushing his empty bowl aside. She met his eyes steadily. "What needs discussing?" "I want to be clear about expectations. I advertised for a wife." "Yes, but," he faltered, searching for words that wouldn't offend. "This is a business arrangement. You'll have your room. I'll have mine. We'll work together to keep the ranch going, share the chores and duties, but I'm not expecting, that is, I won't require." "I understand," she said quietly, saving him from further fumbling. "You need a partner, not a wife in the true sense. That suits me well enough." Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by something that might have been disappointment. He pushed both feelings aside. "The work's hard," he warned. "Water has to be hauled, chickens fed, cows tended. There's cooking, washing, mending. Come winter, it's worse. Snow drifts high as the windows sometimes. We might be cut off from town for weeks. I'm not afraid of work. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles east. Town's 15 miles. It's just us out here most days. As I said, Mr. Thornton. Sometimes lonely is what a person needs." They cleared the table together, working in awkward tandem. When the dishes were done, they sat again, the silence stretching uncomfortable between them. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their calls echoing across the empty land. "I should tell you," Jacob said slowly, "the town folks can be unkind. They've got their opinions about me, about anyone who doesn't fit their notion of proper... Now, with you here, looking like..." He gestured vaguely at her. "They'll talk. They'll make assumptions. People always do." Her voice carried a bitter edge. "Beauty is its own curse. Mr. Thornton. It makes people think they know you, think they have rights to you. I have learned to live with their assumptions." He wanted to ask what had driven her here, what story lay behind those guarded eyes, but they'd agreed to a business arrangement, and personal histories had no place in business. "We'll go to town once a week for supplies," he said instead. "You don't have to come if you'd rather not face them. Hiding only makes the talk worse." She rose, smoothing her skirts. "If you'll excuse me, it's been a long journey." He stood as well, suddenly aware of how the lamplight caught the gold in her hair. "Of course, if you need anything, I'll manage. Good night, Mr. Thornton." "Jacob," he said impulsively. "If we're to work together, you should call me Jacob." She paused at her door. "Good night, Jacob. You may call me Emma." After she'd closed her door, he sat alone in the main room, listening to the small sounds of her settling in, the rustle of fabric, the splash of water in the basin, the creak of the bed ropes. Such ordinary sounds, but they filled the house with a presence it hadn't known in years. He thought of the townspeople's reactions, the troubles that would surely come. A woman like Emma didn't belong in this harsh place. Yet here she was, driven by whatever desperation had led her to answer his advertisement. He should send her back, tell her it was a mistake, but the thought of returning to his solitary existence, now that he'd tasted even this awkward companionship, seemed unbearable. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dust devils dancing across the yard. Jacob banked the fire and prepared for bed, moving quietly so as not to disturb his unexpected bride. In his room, he lay awake long into the night, acutely aware of her presence beyond the thin wall. He'd wanted simple. He'd wanted plain. Instead, he'd gotten Emma Foster, with her beauty that would draw trouble like flowers drew bees, and her secrets that lurked behind those careful eyes. The bargain he'd struck seemed suddenly fraught with dangers he hadn't foreseen, but it was done now. Come morning, they'd begin the delicate dance of two strangers learning to share a life, while keeping their hearts safely locked away. It was what they'd both agreed to, what they both claimed to want. So why did it feel like they were both lying? The drought deepened as the days passed, turning the prairie into a tinderbox. Each morning, Jacob would check the sky for any sign of clouds, but found only the same merciless blue dome. The grass crackled underfoot, brown and lifeless. The cattle grew gaunt, their ribs showing through their dusty hides as they searched futilely for fresh grazing. Emma had been at the ranch for 3 weeks now, and they'd fallen into a routine of sorts. She rose before dawn to start the fire and prepare breakfast while he tended the animals. They worked separately through the morning, him checking fences and moving the cattle to whatever sparse grazing remained, her battling the endless dust that crept through every crack, tending the struggling chickens, and hauling water from the increasingly reluctant well. It was during the 3rd week that the wolves began to circle closer. Jacob first noticed their tracks near the outer pasture, larger than any coyotes. That evening, as the sun painted the horizon crimson, he saw them, 3 gray shadows moving along the ridge, watching the weakened cattle with patient hunger. "We'll need to keep watch tonight," he told Emma over supper. "Wolves are getting bold." She looked up from her plate, those honey eyes steady. "I can shoot." The simple statement surprised him. "You can?" "My father taught me, said a woman alone needs to know how to protect herself." Something flickered in her expression, a shadow of memory quickly suppressed. "I brought my rifle." That night, they took turns standing watch. Jacob took the first shift, rifle across his knees as he sat on the porch. The wolves didn't show themselves, but he could feel them out there in the darkness, waiting. When Emma came to relieve him at midnight, she was fully dressed, her hair braided back, rifle in her hands. "You should sleep," she said. "Dawn comes early." He hesitated. "If they come, I'll wake you." She took his place on the porch step, handling the rifle with easy familiarity. "Go on." But sleep eluded him. Through his window, He could see her silhouette against the stars, alert and watchful. When a wolf howled in the distance, she didn't flinch. When the cattle stirred nervously in the barn, she rose and walked the perimeter, her steps confident despite the darkness. The attack came just before dawn. The wolves had waited until the changing of the guard, that moment when vigilance typically waned. But Emma was still at her post when they struck, 3 shadows flowing like smoke toward the cattle pen. Her first shot cracked through the pre-dawn quiet, followed immediately by Jacob bursting from the house, his own rifle ready. Emma's shot had found its mark. 1 wolf lay still. The other 2 hesitated, torn between hunger and caution. "The left one," Emma said calmly, sighting down her barrel. They fired simultaneously. The wolf yelped and fled, wounded but not dead. The third melted back into the darkness, unwilling to face 2 armed defenders. As the sky lightened, they examined the dead wolf. Emma's shot had been clean, precise. "Where did a woman learn to shoot like that?" Jacob asked. She was already turning away. "When you have something worth protecting, you learn." The incident shifted something between them. Jacob found himself watching her with new appreciation, not just for her beauty, which he tried to ignore, but for her competence. She worked without complaint from dawn to dusk, her soft hands growing calloused, her fine clothes replaced by practical cotton. When the well pump stuck, she helped him repair it. When a fence post needed replacing, she held it steady while he drove it deep. But the drought worsened. The well that had always been reliable began to sputter, yielding muddy water that had to settle before it could be used. The water barrel by the house grew lighter each day. The cattle bellowed their thirst, and 2 of the weaker calves died despite their efforts. It was Emma who suggested they dig a new well. "Where?" Jacob asked, exhausted from another day of watching his ranch wither. "I've lived here 8 years. If there was water to be found, don't you think I'd have found it?" She led him to a spot near a cluster of stunted cottonwoods, the only trees for miles. "Here, see how these trees survive when everything else dies. Water runs deep here." He wanted to argue, but desperation won. They began digging the next morning, taking turns with the shovel as the sun hammered down. By noon, they were both drenched in sweat, covered in dirt, and barely 3 feet down. "This is foolish," Jacob gasped, leaning on the shovel. Emma took it from his hands. "Then be foolish with me." She jumped into the hole and continued digging. Her dress was filthy, her hair escaping its pins, dirt streaking her face. Yet she attacked the earth with fierce determination, as if she could will water from the ground through sheer stubbornness. By evening, they were 6 feet down and still in dry earth. Jacob's hands were raw with blisters. Emma's were no better, though she'd wrapped them in torn strips from her petticoat. "Enough," he said. "We'll kill ourselves for nothing. 1 more foot," she insisted. "Just 1 more." The shovel broke through to damper soil. Emma let out a cry of triumph that turned into exhausted laughter. By full dark, they'd hit water, not much, but enough to prove her instinct right. They sat on the edge of their hole, dirty and exhausted and oddly exhilarated. "How did you know?" Jacob asked. She was quiet for a long moment. "My grandfather had a touch for water, said it was about reading the land, feeling what it's trying to tell you." She looked at him sideways. "You think I'm talking nonsense?" "No," he said slowly. "No. I think you might have saved us." The moment stretched between them, charged with something more than gratitude. Emma's face was tilted toward him, starlight catching in her eyes. Jacob felt himself leaning closer, drawn by something stronger than wisdom. Then a coyote yipped in the distance, breaking the spell, and they both pulled back. "We should go in," Emma said, her voice unsteady. "Early morning tomorrow." As they walked back to the house, Jacob wrestled with the unwelcome feeling stirring in his chest. He'd been so careful to keep his heart locked away, to treat her presence as merely practical. But seeing her today, fierce and determined and covered in dirt, had cracked something open inside him. That night, as they sat at their usual supper, the air between them felt different. Their eyes met and skittered away. Their hands almost touched when reaching for the water pitcher. The silence that had once been comfortable now hummed with tension. In town, the gossips were having a field day. Each weekly supply run brought new whispers, new speculation, misses. Henderson had taken to visiting neighboring ranches, spreading her theories about Emma's past. The Garrison brothers made increasingly bold comments when they thought Jacob couldn't hear. Even Reverend Collins had suggested, delicately, that perhaps Jacob should bring his new bride to church, to quiet the talk. But Emma held her head high through it all, meeting their stares with cool dignity. She spoke when spoken to, ignored the whispers, and conducted herself with such irreproachable propriety that even the worst gossip struggled to find fault beyond her beauty. "Let them talk," she told Jacob one evening after a particularly trying trip to town. "They'll tire of it eventually." But he could see the cost in the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she unpinned her hat. Whatever had driven her to this life, the town's cruelty was wearing on her resolve. That night, the wolves returned, but this time, when Emma took up her rifle for the watch, Jacob stood beside her. "No need for you to lose sleep, too," she said. "Partners share the burden," he replied, echoing her own words from weeks before. They stood side by side in the darkness, weapons ready, protecting what little they had left. And though neither would admit it aloud, they were protecting something else too, this fragile connection building between them, as delicate and precious as water in a drought-stricken land. The storm came without warning on a September night, rolling in from the mountains like God's own fury. Lightning split the sky while thunder shook the house to its foundations. Rain, the first in months, hammered the roof with such violence that conversation became impossible. Jacob had been mending harnesses when the first drops fell. Emma was darning one of his shirts, her needle moving in precise, careful stitches. They both looked up at the sound, hardly daring to believe it. "Rain," Emma breathed, setting aside her work. They rushed to the porch together, watching as the parched earth drank deeply. The smell of wet soil filled the air, rich and promising. Emma stepped out into the downpour, spreading her arms wide, her face turned skyward. The rain plastered her dress to her body, turned her carefully pinned hair into streaming ribbons. "Come inside," Jacob called. "You'll catch your death." But she laughed, the first truly joyful sound he'd heard from her, and spun in the rain like a child. Something in that moment broke through his careful defenses. She was so alive, so radiant with simple happiness, that his heart constricted painfully in his chest. A crack of lightning, closer than the rest, sent them both scrambling inside. They stood dripping in the doorway, Emma still laughing breathlessly. Her eyes met his, bright with rain and exhilaration, and the air between them crackled with more than storm energy. "You're soaked through," he said roughly, grabbing a blanket from the chair. As he wrapped it around her shoulders, their bodies came close, closer than they'd ever been. She looked up at him, water droplets clinging to her lashes, and he found himself drowning in those honey-colored depths. His hand lingered on the blanket, trembling slightly. "Jacob," she whispered, and in her voice he heard an echo of his own longing. Thunder crashed overhead, making them both jump. The spell broke. Emma clutched the blanket tighter and retreated to her room to change. Jacob stood alone, fists clenched, fighting the desire that threatened to consume him. When she emerged in dry clothes, they sat before the fire he'd built to chase away the storm's chill. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. "I should tell you something," Emma said finally, her voice barely audible above the rain's drumming. "About why I came here." Jacob waited, not trusting himself to speak. "I was engaged once, to a wealthy man back in Missouri, Charles Whitman." Her hands twisted in her lap. "My father owed him money, gambling debts. When he couldn't pay, Whitman offered a solution. Me." The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing on the walls. "I thought I could bear it," Told myself many women marry without love. But Charles, she paused, choosing her words carefully. He saw beauty as something to own, to display, like a prize horse or a painting. The wedding preparations went on for months. The dress, the parties, everyone telling me how fortunate I was. What happened? Jacob asked quietly. The night before the wedding, I overheard him talking to his business partners, laughing about how he'd won the prettiest filly in 3 counties, how he'd break me to bridle like his horses. Her voice turned bitter. That's when I understood. I wasn't to be a wife. I was to be a possession. Lightning illuminated her face, revealing tears she hadn't allowed to fall. So I ran, took what money I could find, and fled west. I answered several advertisements before yours. But the men who responded, she shuddered. They all wanted a pretty ornament, just like Charles. Then I read your letter. You specifically wanted someone plain. I thought perhaps you'd be different. But I wasn't, Jacob said, self-loathing thick in his voice. The moment I saw you, I feared. You feared desire. So did I. She turned to face him fully. Don't you see? That's why I felt safe answering your advertisement. A man who wanted a plain wife wouldn't see me as a prize to be won. You're not safe, Jacob said harshly. Not from me, not anymore. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Every day it gets harder. Watching you work, seeing your strength, your kindness. Tonight, in the rain. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass. I'm no better than him. Wanting what I shouldn't want. You're nothing like him. Emma rose, crossing to stand behind him. You've never tried to own me. Never treated me as less than human. We've been partners, true partners. Partners don't feel what I feel. He said to the window. What do you feel? He turned then, finding her closer than expected. Things I swore I'd never feel again. Things that terrify me more than drought or wolves or ruin. I feel them too, she admitted, her voice breaking. Late at night, I lie awake listening to you move in your room. When our hands touch at dinner, I burn for hours after. Is that wrong? Are we betraying our agreement? Yes, he said, even as he reached up to cup her face. This wasn't supposed to happen. Nothing in life happens as it's supposed to. She leaned into his touch. I came here running from one prison, thinking I'd found safety in loneliness. Instead, I found... He kissed her then, unable to resist any longer. She melted against him, all her careful walls crumbling. The storm outside seemed to echo the tempest in their hearts, wild, dangerous, necessary as rain to parched earth. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, reality crashed back. This changes everything, Jacob said. Or nothing, Emma countered. We can pretend this didn't happen. Go back to our arrangement. But they both knew that was impossible. The dam had broken. There would be no rebuilding it. Over the following days, they tried to return to their routine, but everything had shifted. Every glance held weight. Every accidental touch burned. They circled each other like wary animals, desire and fear warring in equal measure. The town noticed the change. On their next supply run, misses. Henderson's sharp eyes missed nothing. Well, she announced to her circle of gossips, seems the hermit's been tamed by his pretty bride. Look at how he watches her. The comments grew bolder, more suggestive. Men tipped their hats to Emma with knowing smirks. Women whispered behind their hands about what went on at the Thornton ranch after dark. Let me guess, Tom Garrison called out as they loaded supplies. The ice finally melted. Eh, Thornton? About time. Waste of a woman like that, keeping her at arm's length. Jacob's fists clenched, but Emma's hand on his arm stopped him. Pay them no mind, she murmured. They see only what they expect to see. But the damage was deeper than gossip. That night, as they sat at dinner, the question hung between them. What were they to each other now? The business arrangement lay in ruins, but neither knew how to navigate what remained. I won't be like him, Jacob said suddenly. I won't trap you with my feelings. Emma set down her fork. And if I want to be trapped? You don't know what you're saying. This place, This life, it's already a prison. Add love to it, and the bars only get stronger. Or maybe love is what makes the prison bearable, she said softly. Maybe it's what transforms duty into choice. He shook his head. I've lost one woman to this land. I won't risk another. I'm not Martha, Emma said, a flash of anger in her eyes. And I'm not made of spun glass. I've survived worse than drought and gossip. Have you survived watching someone you love waste away? Have you held them as fever burned their life to ash? His voice broke. Because I have, and I won't do it again. The storm had passed, but its aftermath remained, the air between them charged with possibility and pain. They were no longer the strangers who'd made a practical bargain, but what they were becoming, neither could yet say. That night, Emma sat at her window, watching clouds gather on the horizon. Change was coming. She could feel it in the air, in the restless wind that whispered of autumn's approach. Behind her door, she heard Jacob pacing, wrestling with demons she was only beginning to understand. They had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The only question now was whether they'd walk through it together, or let fear keep them forever on the threshold. The stranger arrived on a Thursday morning, riding a black thoroughbred that gleamed with expensive care. Jacob was repairing the chicken coop when he heard the approaching hoofbeats, not the plodding gait of a ranch horse, but the measured stride of quality horseflesh. He straightened, hammer in hand. As the rider came into view, the man was everything Jacob wasn't. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that cost more than most ranchers saw in a year. His face was handsome in a hard way, with pale eyes that swept the property with proprietary interest before settling on Jacob. You'd be Thornton, the man said. It wasn't a question. I am, and you're on my land. The stranger smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Charles Whitman, I believe you have something that belongs to me. Jacob's grip tightened on the hammer. Nothing here belongs to you. We'll see about that. Whitman dismounted with practiced ease, tying his horse to the fence post like he owned the place. Where is she? If you're looking for someone. Tri-Town. This is private property. Come now. Thornton, we both know Emma's here. The whole territory knows about the beautiful bride who answered your advertisement. Whitman pulled out a cigar, taking his time lighting it. Caused quite a stir, I'm told, a woman like that choosing a man like you. The kitchen door opened. Emma emerged, carrying the water bucket. She froze at the sight of Whitman, the color draining from her face. The bucket slipped from her hands, water splashing across the dusty ground. Hello, Emma, Whitman said pleasantly. You've led me quite a chase. You have no right to be here, she said, but her voice trembled. On the contrary, I have every right. We have an agreement. You and I, a contract signed by your father, legally binding. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. You're my property, bought and paid for. I'm no one's property, Emma said, lifting her chin despite her obvious fear. The law says otherwise. Whitman's smile widened. Your father's debts, remember? $20,000. I paid them in exchange for you. That makes you mine. Jacob stepped forward, placing himself between them. The lady is my wife now. Any claim you had is void. Whitman laughed. Wife? I think not. I've made inquiries. No marriage certificate filed in this county. No church ceremony. Just two people living in sin, as far as the law is concerned. Get off my land, Jacob said quietly. Or what? You'll shoot me? Beat me with that hammer? Whitman blew smoke lazily. I don't think so. You're not that kind of man. Thornton. Too civilized. Too weak. His eyes slid past Jacob to Emma. That's why she felt safe here, isn't it? Hiding behind a man who doesn't have the spine to fight for her. Jacob's fist connected with Whitman's jaw before anyone could react. The bigger man stumbled back, more surprised than hurt. He touched his lip, saw blood, and his expression darkened. That was a mistake, he said softly. The mistake was coming here. Jacob's stance had shifted. No longer the quiet rancher, but something harder, more dangerous. Leave, now. Whitman straightened his coat. I'll be back, with the sheriff, the judge, whoever it takes. That woman is mine by law, and I'll have her." He mounted his horse, looking down at them with cold satisfaction. "Enjoy your time together. It won't last long." After he'd ridden away, Emma sank to her knees in the spilled water. Jacob knelt beside her, but she flinched when he tried to touch her. $20,000, she whispered. "I didn't know it was so much. I didn't know he'd—" She looked up at Jacob with desperate eyes. "I'll leave. Tonight. I won't bring this trouble to you." "You're not going anywhere." "You don't understand. Charles has connections everywhere. Judges, lawmen, politicians. He'll destroy you to get to me. Let him try." She shook her head violently. "You don't know him. What he's capable of. The things he's done to people who crossed him." Her voice dropped. "There was a girl, before me, another debt to be paid. She tried to run too. They found her in the river. He won't touch you. How can you promise that? You said yourself you wouldn't risk another loss? Well, here it is, the loss coming for you. Let me go before—" He pulled her against him, cutting off her protests. "I've been a coward," he said into her hair, "hiding behind my grief, using Martha's death as an excuse to stop living. But you changed that. You made me want things again, feel things again." He pulled back to look at her. "I won't let fear rule me anymore. Not his, not mine." That afternoon, they rode to town together. Word had already spread. Whitman had made sure of it. He'd stopped at the saloon, the general store, the hotel, telling anyone who'd listen about the runaway bride and the debt she owed. By the time Jacob and Emma reached Main Street, the whole town was buzzing. Sheriff Morrison was waiting outside his office, badge glinting in the afternoon sun. Beside him stood Judge Carter, and beside the judge, Whitman himself, looking satisfied as a cat with cream. "Jacob," the sheriff said, not unkindly, "we need to sort this out legal-like." "Nothing to sort," Jacob replied. "Emma is my wife, without papers." Judge Carter adjusted his spectacles. "Mister, Whitman has shown me a legal contract, unless you can prove a prior claim." "How much?" Jacob interrupted. Whitman's eyes sharpened. "Pardon?" "The debt. How much to clear it?" $20,000, plus interest. Call it $25,000 even." The crowd that had gathered gasped. It was more money than most would see in a lifetime. "I don't have that kind of money," Jacob said. "But I have land, cattle, everything I own against the debt." Emma grabbed his arm. "No, Jacob, no, the ranch is everything to you." "No," he said, looking at her. "You are—" Whitman considered. "The ranch is worth maybe $10,000, if we're generous. Not nearly enough. Then we settle this another way." Jacob's hand moved to his gun. "You and me, winner takes all." The crowd pulled back. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "Now hold on. It's legal," Judge Carter said slowly. "Mutual combat to settle a dispute, as long as both parties agree." Whitman smiled. "You're not a gunfighter. Thornton, you're a rancher who's held a weapon maybe twice in anger. I've killed 7 men in fair fights. You'd be number 8. Then you have nothing to worry about." "Jacob, please," Emma whispered. This is what he wants. Another death on his hands. But Jacob's mind was made up. "Tomorrow, noon, middle of Main Street. I'll be there." Whitman agreed. "And when you're dead, Emma comes with me. No more running, no more hiding." That night, Emma paced the ranch house like a caged animal. "There has to be another way. We could leave tonight, head for California, and spend our lives looking over our shoulders." Jacob was calm, cleaning his revolver with methodical care. "No, this ends tomorrow, one way or another. You'll die for nothing, for pride, not for pride." He set the gun aside, took her hands. "For the right to love you without fear, for the chance to build a life without his shadow over us, that's worth any risk." She kissed him then, desperately, as if trying to memorize the taste of him. When they broke apart, tears streaked her cheeks. "I love you," she said. "I should have said it before. Should have—" "Tell me tomorrow," he said. "After But they both knew there might not be an after. In 12 hours, one of them would likely be planning a funeral. The night stretched ahead, precious and terrible. While the clock on the mantel counted down to noon, the morning of the duel dawned clear and still, as if nature itself held its breath. Jacob rose before first light, moving quietly so as not to wake Emma, though he doubted she'd slept any more than he had. Through the window, he could see stars fading into a lightening sky. In a few hours, those same stars might be looking down on his corpse. He dressed carefully. Clean shirt, best trousers, the leather vest Martha had made him years ago. His hands were steady as he strapped on his gun belt, though his heart hammered against his ribs. In the mirror, he saw a man he barely recognized. Harder, more determined than the lonely rancher who'd written to a matrimonial agency just months before. Emma stood in the doorway, still in her nightdress, hair loose around her shoulders. "I won't watch you die," she said flatly. "Then watch me live." He crossed to her, framing her face with his hands. "Have faith in me, Emma, in us. Faith won't stop a bullet. No, but fear won't either." He kissed her forehead. "Whatever happens, know that these weeks with you have been worth everything." They rode to town in silence, Emma rigid beside him on the wagon seat. As they neared Main Street, they could see the crowd already gathering. Word had spread through the territory. A duel over a woman, like something from the old days. People had come from miles around to witness it. Whitman was already there, standing outside the saloon with a group of well-dressed men who looked like hired guns. He'd changed into black from head to toe, playing the part of death itself. When he saw Jacob, he smiled and pulled out his pocket watch. 20 minutes to noon. Thornton. Still time to reconsider. Sign over the ranch. Let Emma honor her obligations and walk away breathing. No. Sheriff Morrison approached, looking deeply unhappy. "I've got to ask once more. As a matter of law, is there no other way to settle this?" "Ask him," Jacob said, nodding toward Whitman. "The terms are set," Whitman said. "The rancher challenged me. I choose the weapons, pistols, and the distance. 20 paces. The crowd was growing, filling the sidewalks and balconies. Jacob spotted familiar faces. Mrs. Henderson clutching her handkerchief. The Garrison brothers taking bets. Reverend Collins with his Bible pressed to his chest, and others too. People who'd barely acknowledged him in years, drawn by the spectacle of violence. Emma gripped his arm. "Look at them. They're here for blood, not justice. Let them watch," Jacob said. "Let them see what a man will do for love." As noon approached, the sheriff cleared the street. Someone had drawn lines in the dust 20 paces apart. The crowd fell silent, even the children sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. Jacob took his position at one end of the street. At the other, Whitman waited, relaxed and confident. Between them, Sheriff Morrison stood with a white handkerchief. "The rules are simple," the sheriff called out. "When I drop this handkerchief, you draw and fire. First man down loses. Any man who draws early will be shot where he stands by my deputies." "Understood?" Both men nodded. Time seemed to slow. Jacob could hear his own heartbeat, feel the sun on his face, smell the dust and gunpowder already thick in the air. He found Emma in the crowd, her face pale but fierce. She wasn't crying now. She was watching him with an intensity that gave him strength. The handkerchief fluttered in the sheriff's raised hand. Whitman's stance shifted slightly, the move of a professional killer preparing to draw. He'd done this before, many times. His hand would be quick, his aim true. But Jacob had something Whitman didn't. He had everything to lose. The handkerchief fell. Whitman's hand moved like lightning, his gun clearing leather in a motion too fast for the eye to follow. The crack of his shot split the air, but Jacob had already moved, stepping sideways as he drew, using a trick learned not from gunfighting but from dodging charging bulls. Whitman's bullet sang past his ear. Jacob's gun came up slower but steadier, and he fired. The bullet caught Whitman high in the shoulder, spinning him around. His gun fell from nerveless fingers as he dropped to one knee, clutching the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers, but he was alive. "Kill me then," Whitman gasped. "Finish it." Jacob walked forward, gun still trained on the wounded man. The crowd held its breath. By the code of the duel, he had the right to fire again. "No," Jacob said, holstering his weapon. "You'll live, but you'll leave. Today. And if you ever come near Emma again, if you so much as send a letter, I won't miss your heart next time. The debt dies with your claim to her." Jacob pulled out a paper, a marriage certificate, dated that morning. "We were married at dawn, by Reverend Collins, legal and binding. Any claim you had is void." Whitman's face contorted with rage and pain. "You think this ends it? I have friends, influence, and a bullet wound that'll remind you what happens when you try to own what can't be owned." Jacob turned his back on the fallen man, walking toward Emma. She ran to him, throwing herself into his arms with a sob. Around them, the crowd erupted, some cheering, others grumbling about the unsatisfying end to the spectacle. But Jacob heard none of it. His world had shrunk to the woman in his arms, alive and free, and his— "You knew," she whispered, "about his draw, his stance. You knew he'd aim for your heart." Martha's father was a gunfighter before he found God. Jacob admitted. "Taught me a few things about reading a man's intentions. Whitman's killed 7 men the same way. Quick draw. Heart shot. He's predictable. You could have died. But I didn't." He pulled back to look at her. This woman who'd brought him back to life. "And now we have a future to build." The doctor was tending to Whitman, who was already demanding a horse, eager to leave town before his humiliation grew worse. His fancy friends had melted away, unwilling to associate with a loser. By evening, he'd be gone, heading back east with his tail between his legs. As Jacob and Emma walked back to their wagon, the townspeople parted before them. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked at Emma with new eyes, not as a scandal or a beauty to be possessed, but as a woman who'd inspired a man to risk everything. "Mrs." Henderson approached. Her usual disapproving expression softened. "That was a brave thing you did, Mr. Thornton." "Not brave," Jacob said, helping Emma onto the wagon seat. "Necessary." As they rode home, Emma leaned against his shoulder. "What you said back there, about everything to lose, was true." He took her hand, feeling the wedding band they'd placed there that morning. "I spent 3 years thinking I had nothing left to lose. Then you arrived and showed me I was wrong. I had my fear to lose, my loneliness, my walls." He squeezed her hand. "Losing those things to gain you was the best trade I ever made." The sun was setting by the time they reached the ranch, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The house that had once seemed so empty now felt like home. They'd won more than a duel today. They'd won the right to love without fear, to build a life without shadows. "I love you," Emma said as they stood on the porch, looking out at their land. "I should have married you properly weeks ago. You married me the day you dug that well." Jacob said, "Everything after was just paperwork." She laughed, the sound bright as water in the desert. "Then let's make it real, all of it. No more separate rooms, no more careful distance. We've earned the right to be foolish in love." He swept her into his arms, carrying her over the threshold like the bride she'd always been meant to be. Behind them, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to the end of one story and the beginning of another. The duel was over. The real life, messy, difficult, glorious, was just beginning. The weeks following the duel brought changes to the Thornton Ranch. Word of Jacob's stand against Whitman had spread through the territory, earning him a respect he'd never sought but couldn't deny. Neighbors who hadn't visited in years began stopping by, offering help with repairs or sharing news from town. The isolation that had once defined the ranch began to ease, like ice thawing in spring. Emma threw herself into transforming their house into a true home. Curtains appeared at windows that had stood bare for years. She coaxed the garden back to life with patient tending, and soon green shoots pushed through the earth that had seemed permanently barren. The new well Jacob had helped her dig proved reliable, even as other ranches struggled with the continuing drought. One morning, as autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and rust, Jacob found Emma standing by Martha's grave on the hill overlooking the ranch. He'd never taken her there, had barely visited it himself since Emma's arrival. But there she stood, a bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning. "I wanted to pay my respects." Jacob moved to stand beside her. The headstone was simple: Martha Thornton, beloved wife, with the dates of her brief life carved below. "She was lucky," Emma said softly, "to be so loved, to be mourned so deeply. I thought I'd die when she did." Jacob admitted, "Part of me did die. But you," he struggled for words, "you didn't bring that part back to life. You grew something new in its place, something stronger." Emma laid the flowers on the grave. "Thank you," she whispered to the stone, "for loving him first, for teaching him how to love. I promise to take care of him." They stood together in comfortable silence, the wind whispering through the grass. There was no jealousy, no competition with the dead. Just acknowledgement of all that had come before and all that lay ahead. In town, the transformation in how people viewed Emma was equally remarkable. The woman they'd once whispered about as a scandal had become something of a local legend. Young women looked at her with admiration rather than envy. Men tipped their hats with respect rather than leering interest. Funny how a little gunplay changes folks' perspectives, Sheriff Morrison commented one day as they loaded supplies. "It wasn't the gunplay," Jacob said. "It was the choice. People saw Emma had chosen this life, chosen me, made all the difference." The sheriff nodded. "Heard from the county seat that Whitman headed back east, sold off his interests here. Won't be coming back. You two can rest easy." But they were already resting easy. The fear that had haunted their early days together had dissolved like morning mist. In its place grew something solid and enduring, a partnership tested by fire and strengthened by trust. As winter approached, they worked side by side preparing for the cold months ahead. The barn was reinforced, hay stocked high, the root cellar filled with preserves Emma had put up from the garden's yield. The house was tight against the wind, with enough wood split to see them through the worst storms. One evening, as snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes, they sat before the fire planning for spring. The drought had broken, and with careful management, the ranch could prosper again. "We could add to the herd," Jacob suggested, sketching rough figures on a slate. "Maybe try some of those new breeding techniques Thompson's been talking about. And expand the garden," Emma added. "Maybe sell vegetables in town come summer. Mrs. Henderson mentioned the hotel's always looking for fresh produce." They talked late into the night, dreams growing larger with each shared word. Children were mentioned, tentatively at first, then with growing excitement. The empty rooms upstairs could be filled with laughter. The ranch could become what it had always meant to be, not just a place of survival, but a home for generations. "No more mail-order brides, though," Emma teased. "Our daughters will choose their own paths, and our sons will know how to respect a woman's choices." Jacob agreed. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the prairie in pristine white, but inside, warmed by fire and love. They barely noticed. The world had shrunk to this room, these plans, this precious present they'd fought so hard to claim. As the fire burned low, Jacob pulled Emma close. "Do you ever regret it? Answering that advertisement?" "Every choice I made led me here," she said simply. "How could I regret the path that brought me home?" He thought of his own journey, the grief that had nearly destroyed him, the desperate letter to a matrimonial agency, the fear when beauty arrived instead of plainness. All of it necessary, all of it perfect in its imperfection. "I love you," he said, words that came easily now. "And I love you," she replied. "My unexpected husband, my chosen life." They made their way upstairs. no longer to separate rooms but to the bed they now shared as truly married couples do. The house that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with contentment. The man who had expected a plain bride had received so much more: a partner, a friend, a love that transformed hardship into joy. In the morning, they would wake to a world made new by snow, with chores to do and plans to make. But for now, they held each other close while winter sang its ancient song outside their windows. They had survived drought and gossip, faced down the past and claimed their future. Together, they would weather whatever storms might come. The ranch stood solid against the prairie wind, no longer a monument to loss, but a testament to the courage of two people who dared to reach for happiness despite their fears. In the barn, the cattle lowed contentedly. In the coop, chickens roosted against the cold. And in the house, two hearts beat as one. Proof that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead to exactly where we're meant to be. Jacob had written seeking a plain bride to share his burden. Instead, he'd found Emma, beautiful, brave, and broken in ways that matched his own damage perfectly. She hadn't been what he'd ordered, but she'd been what he needed. Together, they'd transformed a business arrangement into a love story worthy of the wild frontier that had witnessed its birth. The snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of all who'd come before, preparing a clean slate for all that was to come. And in the warmth of their bed, Jacob and Emma Thornton faced that future without fear, knowing that whatever challenges awaited, they would meet them hand in hand. Dawn would break soon over the Wyoming prairie, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. A new day in a new life, built on the ashes of the old. The man who'd expected a plain bride had learned the most important lesson the frontier could teach. Sometimes what we think we want and what we truly need are as different as drought and rain, and just as necessary for growth. Their story would be told in Willow Creek for generations. The hermit rancher and the runaway beauty who'd found in each other not what they'd sought, but what they'd needed all along. It was a tale of the real West, where courage mattered more than convention, and love could bloom even in the harshest soil. And so they lived, not happily ever after, for this was real life. Not a fairy tale, but deeply, truly, and well, making their own happiness one shared sunrise at a time. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps while working? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's connect and share our love for these frontier stories together.